This video is about a few things. You'd be forgiven for thinking it's just a video about repairing a pair of gloves, but it's also about why it's often futile to repair certain objects, or objects made a certain way. It's about me getting used to a lesser known and unusual sewing machine, showing some of the steps that go into making traditional leather gloves, and to show the mistakes I made. This pair of gloves was old when I bought them, years ago in a vintage clothes store in Edinburgh. I wore them for a few years, after which they started to break down. The stitching came loose, and the lining was falling to pieces. As I'll explain later, many gloves can be repaired when this happens, and many can't. You can see in the video that the stitching wasn't resisting being pulled apart. It would have had a cotton or linen thread. I know this because I tried burning some of it later. If the thread chars, it's a natural fiber. If it melts, it's synthetic. Old natural thread does have a shelf life. I prefer to use synthetic thread for gloves when I'm making them for this reason, even though generally I prefer to use natural materials when I can. The reason I decided to repair this pair of gloves, despite that often being futile for machine-stitched gloves, is that I'd grown attached to this pair, and for an opportunity to finally make another video on the topic. I pulled apart as many of the pieces as I could, carefully. I knew the leather was great quality. If it was also tearing due to age, then it would be a substandard leather, or it would have been dry. But this is likely hair sheepskin, a superior leather for gloves due to its high tensile strength. Some of the seams had to be carefully unpicked using a seam picker. The strip of leather that wraps around the cuff is called a welt, which will be discussed later. The gloves had lovely original snap buttons, which unfortunately couldn't be reused. The original lining was in bad shape, although the construction was interesting. The top part looked a little like the wool and cashmere linings I use for my own gloves, although it didn't have panels on the side of the fingers, and it had a rabbit skin cuff stitched to the base. The hair in this skin makes for a warm cuff, even decades after it was originally made. That said, it couldn't be reused. I knew these gloves were made the right way, in part due to the small diamond-shaped pieces at the webbing in between each finger. These are called quirks, and I only see them on well-made leather gloves. The components in between each finger that run along their length are called fourchettes, the French word for fork. Quirks are stitched to fourchettes, and then, as shown later, stitched to the rest of the gloves. The way this glove was made was done exactly the same way as when I make gloves, so I had good confidence in being able to remake them. I decided to keep all of the components that I was replacing with new leather, mostly out of curiosity. They would make for a good reference if I ever wanted to compare my work to that of the past. I get people asking me constantly for patterns. While I can't just give out patterns, you might try finding an old pair like this and studying them, taking them apart, and learning from them as much as you can. I decided to use the main glove panel, called a trank, and the thumbs. In hindsight, I should have cut new thumbs, as I'll explain later. I didn't have enough of the leather I used to do this, and besides, you can't always know this when working on a project. I disassembled both gloves completely into their individual parts. To remove the old snap buttons, I used pincers, also known as nail pullers. I used them to snap off the extrusion on the snap, after which they generally just fall off. I went over the old components, removing any remnant stitching. This was time consuming, but I didn't want any of the old stitching getting in the way of the new. As mentioned earlier, the strip of leather at the cuff is called a welt. We can't reuse this. It's cut wider than is needed, stitched in place, then trimmed. It would be impossible to reuse it, so I discarded it. Taking a closer look at the lining, I can see how it was made. The cloth parts were cut slightly smaller than the trank, offset by a few millimeters. They were not given their own fourchettes, but simply stitched together at the top of each finger. The rabbit skin was a simple panel, stitched to this lining. Someone asked me before about making gloves using rabbit. While the fur is excellent as a lining, the skin itself is too thin to be structural, so it cannot be relied on to actually hold the glove together. It should be glued to a stronger piece of leather, such as sheepskin. There are small leather strips stitched to the top of each finger. They are rare but gratifying to see. I also use these. They're intended to allow you to stitch the lining to the gloves instead of just gluing the lining in place. If you glue the lining in place, it may pull away from the fingers when you take your hands out of the gloves. If they're stitched in place, then the maker was thinking about longevity. Here are the linings I use. They're just a woven blend of wool and cashmere, and are inserted into the finished gloves and stitched in place using the exact same method. Here is the fourchette again. I know how this was made. It was cut as a long rectangle piece, stitched in place, and then trimmed. I'll show this process later. Quirks, the small diamonds, give you a greater ease of movement when wearing the gloves. They allow you to move your fingers without shifting the whole glove up your hand. This is the template I use when cutting out new fourchettes. The ones in these gloves were undoubtedly made using a similar pattern, and made using the same method I use. The leather is old, tired, and wrinkled. I use an iron on high heat and no steam to help the leather remember its old shape. Don't put an iron directly on leather, and never ever use steam. I iron the leather until it is slightly smoothed out. Then I gently stretch out the components by hand, making sure not to test the leather too much. If I didn't do this, then this would happen. I would stitch the glove back together again using the new components and the old components. The new components would be stretched out, which is a key step in making leather gloves. But if I stitched them to wrinkled, slouched leather, they wouldn't be allowed to return to their elastic resting point, and the fit would be affected. This leather was dry. It's a risk to stitch or work or stretch or wear leather that is dry, so I use a mink oil based conditioner to give the leather some much needed moisture. I was fairly liberal with the conditioner and applied it until the leather stopped immediately soaking it in. Then I just wiped off the excess and gave it a buff using a shoe brush. I had a small amount of hair sheep leather that was a close colour match to this. Of course, it didn't match exactly, as old sheepskin gets a more pronounced crackled grain, but over time the two leathers will age and meld together. It's a close match. I cut out the new components. 6 fourchettes, 6 quirks, and 3 welts for the cuff. I only needed 2 welts, but I wanted a third to be safe. I don't normally like to use silver ink pen when marking leather. It doesn't always wash off. But for the components that are going to be trimmed, it's not a big deal. I need to calibrate my machine to match the stitches used on the original gloves. Using a ruler, I lined up one of the seams and counted how many stitches there were in 1 inch. This gives you a measurement called SPI, or stitches per inch. The machine I'm using, the Singer 172K, has a dial on the side with numerical readouts that can easily be set to a given SPI. This pair was stitched using 12 stitches per inch. This was where I made the first of many mistakes. When thinking about what thread to use, I debated going for a low contrast, a no contrast, or a high contrast option, of which I selected the latter. I should have chosen a no contrast brown thread, which would have hidden my mistakes better. The off-white thread I used would have been nice had I been making a new pair of gloves, but such is life. I stitched the quirks to the fourchettes. That is, the little diamonds to the pieces of leather that will go in between each finger. This style of thumb is called a Bolton thumb. It replaced historical round thumbs because it allows the thumb a good range of movement. The pattern of this thumb has its own inbuilt quirk. What I love the most about the Bolton thumb is because it incorporates all of these angles and straight lines in the pattern, it gives you a lot of reference points that you can use to line up both the thumb and the thumb hole when stitching the glove. Reference points are better than a round shape, so the round thumb patterns were hard to stitch and were less comfortable. I stitched the original thumbs back in place. Mistake number 2, I glued the thumb pieces in place, which when stitching gloves you shouldn't do. Glue should not be needed. My justification was I wanted the original stitch holes to line up, and this is where I'll talk about the futility of repairing gloves like these. 12 stitches per inch make for really small stitches. My worry was that if I wasn't hitting exactly the same stitch holes when stitching the components back together again, the sewing machine would make new holes next to the old holes. This would weaken the leather, and it meant that there would be even less material to hold everything together. Nonetheless, I stitched the thumb back in place, with a result that I found less than desirable. I ended up restitching part of it later, but what I would do again were I to redo this would be either cut a new thumb, or offset the stitch line so that I would not be using the original holes, but creating a new seam further in. This would make the thumb smaller, but it would be stronger. Next, the fourchettes were stitched to the fingers, on the palm side first. This was a lot more straightforward than the thumb, as it is a lot of long, straight stitch lines. The quirk is clamped in place with a small clip, and then you stitch along the fingers until you reach it. You stitch back up the other finger, this time clamping the fourchette to the center of the tip of the finger. I did this along the edges of each finger, from the tip of the pinky to the tip of the index finger. After trimming off the excess fourchette for each finger, then I stitched the glove closed. This involves folding over the trank and joining the other half of the finger to the other edge of the fourchette. If you've measured and cut everything correctly, you should have exactly the right amount of material. The result is decent. The stitching isn't as good as when I make new gloves, but I was so focused on stitching over the original stitch holes that I sometimes stopped and started to seam a second time, doubling up in the thread. But the fit is almost exactly the same. A few points needed some further trimming or restitching, and the little fingers on the original gloves were actually too long for me. I marked the length of the little fingers where they were meant to be for my hand and stitched them a little shorter. It was time to add the new linings. I use a tool that I designed, but it's a little unorthodox and made from scrap metal tubes and rods. It's used to grip each finger in such a way that makes them easy to pull inside out. I do this when stitching the lining in place. I stitched the tip of each finger on the lining in place to the small tab of leather in the glove. It'll hold well enough to ensure the lining doesn't pull away when I take off the gloves. I then use the same tool to pull the fingers backside in, returning them to normal. The final step is to stitch the welt in place. The welt is stitched twice. Once to keep the lining in place, then the lining is trimmed, the welt is bound over the edge, and then stitched wall folded, keeping it in place. I didn't have any decorative snaps, so I ended up using simple plain silver snaps instead. On the original gloves, the only part that never fit me was the snaps. I could never get them closed, so I only intended to replace the snaps for aesthetic purposes. My guess is people used to have smaller wrists. With the gloves done, let me summarize a few points I made earlier. I'm not suggesting machine-stitched gloves shouldn't be repaired. They can be. But with the small stitching, the extent of disrepair, the limited amount of new material, and the ancient sewing machine, this particular pair was quite difficult to get a professional result with. Hand-stitched gloves are far easier to repair. I won't go into why in this video. I absolutely think that anything special to you deserves to be repaired, but there is a limit to what a person would be willing to pay to do so. The time it took to remake these gloves was, in my opinion, more than I would be willing to pay someone to repair these gloves, when it would have taken less time to just make a new pair. That said, it pains me to throw good leather in the trash. If you paid money to get something well made out of leather, then take my advice. Keep it in good shape. Condition the leather so it doesn't dry. Clean it using the right soap. Make sure the fit is right and you're not overstraining it. Don't use the same pair of leather gloves or shoes 2 days in a row. Let them dry out in between uses. And, most importantly of all, get it repaired when the damage is small. Don't wait for it to get worse. You will pay more at best, and at worst, the damage will be too much. I hope you enjoyed this video. There is more soon to come.